Today I'm really excited to share with you my do's and don'ts of blocking your crochet. I love blocking. I love the process of blocking. I love the fact that you take something that is just surprisingly wiggly and wobbly around the edges, given your excellent stitches and tension, and then make it all beautifully neat and uniform. It's just really cool. This is my blocking board. I took the squares off it because I have already filmed this video once and I forgot to turn the microphone on. So it's a lot of, which I felt probably wasn't very useful. Forgive me, but we're going to start with an obvious one. Do block. Now you're probably here because you know that you need to block, but I really avoided blocking for a little while. I mostly made 3D stuff anyway, so it wasn't really a problem, but I kind of felt like it was a pointless step that was delaying the process and me getting to the end, and I like to do things fast. So it took me a go or two to realize that this really was something I needed to do, and I would just like to pass that wisdom on to you so you don't end up with a couple of wiggly wobbly projects that are too big now to block after you finish, but will never be quite as beautiful as they would have been otherwise. Do dampen your yarn before pinning it out. And by dampen, I mean just get a spray bottle. That's easy for me to say. I have a lot of lizards that require spraying, so I've got a lot of spray bottles. But get a spray bottle if you can. Otherwise, lie it down, get a sponge or a flannel that's quite wet and just drizzle it, squeeze it backwards and forwards. It has a similar but not quite as good effect. But dampen before you pin it out on the board. Do choose a solid board to block on. That might sound like slightly unusual advice, but let me explain. Some of the boards that are sold as blocking boards are quite flimsy. You'll notice that sort of the depth, the diameter of the backing of the board is not particularly thick. One of the things about blocking that really helps it to work is stretching the yarn slightly and putting it under tension. But if your yarn is under tension through pegs through the board and the board is not very solid, it can cause the board to bow and distort. Ultimately, it can break the board, which means it's not useful. But likewise, if the board has any flex or give to it, you're not then structuring what you're blocking quite as neatly either. So, solid board. Do try to get one that has metal pins like this. The reason that I go with metal pins is not just because of that effect of the sort of the tension and the weight essentially that's put on the board when it's under pressure and the pegs, but because they are more likely to be smooth. Just like I recommend with the head of a crochet hook, give it a little bit of a run through of your fingers and a stroke first. The wooden ones, if they have splinters, are just a complete nightmare for pushing the yarn down on, because you push the yarn down on it and then the fibers catch on the splintering, and not only does it get stuck and you can't push it down, but it also potentially can tear your work as well, which, as you know, is just infuriating when you've just finished something and you're like, hooray, it's done, I'm going to block it out. Now it's broken. Nobody wants that. Do get the biggest board that you can. So obvious restrictions being the space in your room and your budget. Bigger is better. If you're investing in a blocking board, as long as it's a suitable type, get a big one, because you're going to get more adventurous with your projects probably. You'll have bigger things. It's just frustrating to have something that you want to pin out and you can't. Get the biggest one you can. But with that in mind, do get a board with plenty of size options. And by size options, you can see here, I don't know if I'm pointing the right direction, so I'm looking at the camera on my screens there. See here? There's quite a lot of little rows of holes for these pins to go into, and the more peg holes you have, the more options you have. If you think about how deep a single crochet is, in an ideal world we'd have a pegboard that is dots apart as wide as a single crochet so that we can really play around with the width. Obviously that's impractical, but as far as you can, get one with lots and lots and lots of different little peg holes so that you can have the minutiae of the size of the things that you want to pin out just right. Do plan your projects based on your board. I nearly fell foul of this recently, so I'm making a big autumn/fall for the Americans granny square blanket. Let me show you. These are my squares. They are exactly the size of the edge of my blocking board. If I had gone a couple of rounds bigger, my blocking board would not have been big enough to block them effectively and I would have been a bit gutted. Just make sure before you get enthusiastic about a project like that, it pays to base it a little bit on the board that you're working with, because it makes such a difference to the structure of the squares. Do block in sections where possible. So obviously it's nice and straightforward for a granny square, isn't it? That comes together in pieces and then we crochet it together afterwards. But for garments, things like that, where the separate parts can be made separately, if you make them apart and then block them apart before putting them together, the edges are going to be neater. Do attach it together as soon as you can once you finish that part. When we spray and dampen and then pin out our pieces, they make these beautiful structured squares or whatever shape you're going for. Once you've taken them off the blocking board, there's going to be an amount of natural change where they're going to slightly want to go back to the shape that they were to begin with, shall we say. In my experience, the quicker that you crochet your granny squares together or sew your garment together, the more likely it is to stay in the nice neat shape once it's finished. The longer you leave them off the blocking board before attaching them, the more wavy and wiggly they're going to get again. And I've kind of alluded to this before, but it's worthy of its own thing. Stretch the shape slightly. So if we take the example of one of our granny squares, here's what the square looks like. Now this has been on the blocking board overnight, so it is a relatively neat shape already. But when I put it on the board, I'm not just going to poke the pins through at the point that it is. I'm going to slightly stretch, and depending on the type of yarn you're doing, there'll be more or less stretch. You don't want to overstretch it again, because that will misshape it and not look as pretty, but you want to pin it so that it has a little bit of stretch and it's under a little bit of tension. That gives you the best possible chance of having the shape that you want. Don't wet the yarn without reading the packet. Almost every yarn you can get a little bit wet, right? But some of them are more sensitive to water than others. Best to check this before starting the project, and if it's something you're going to block, just try and avoid a yarn that is really unhappy when you wet it. And some of the novelty yarns will be like that. I also haven't had great luck with wetting some chenille yarns. There's a sort of a tendency to be a bit clumpy afterwards, and it's always worth making a sample as well. Now if you're making granny square, make a little granny square, wet it, pin it up, and just make sure that it's going to look and feel the right texture as well after you're done. Don't soak the yarn. We've all been there. We've all got over enthusiastic or tipped too much water or sprayed too hard on the wrong setting. Don't soak the yarn though. There's just no need at the end of the day. It also makes a big old mess. It only needs to be damp. So damp so that it feels wet to the touch, but if you wring it out, no water's going to fall down and it's not going to drip water onto your desk either. If you have soaked it, don't panic and dry it with heat. Again, some yarns are a bit temperamental in terms of temperature. People have apparently some quite strong opinions on whether that's true or not. It's true in my opinion and in my experience, and I just don't think it's worth the risk. Don't worry if you've made it too wet. All you need to do is pop it off the blocking board again, dry the blocking board off, put it between two bits of towel and do the old classic pat dry until, again, it's not wringing out water when you squeeze it. Don't take it off too soon. A good rule of thumb that I use these days is 2 or 3 days on the blocking board. I might give it a respray halfway through, but often I won't remember to, or I just won't. Overnight for some types of yarn and some projects just does the job fine, but there's no too long on the blocking board. If you've blocked it correctly and it's not overstretched, it doesn't hurt just to stick it on there and leave it on there if there's no time sensitivity involved. It's fine. Don't sew then block. That sounds obvious, but again, born out of personal experience putting garments together and then wondering how on earth I'm going to block it. We'll come on to that in a moment. In the little composite parts as much as you can, do it in the sections, block it in its sections, and then pop it together afterwards. It's much easier that way. And don't be afraid to improvise. So when I first realized I needed to block, I didn't have a blocking board. And what I did was I put the squares under some big books. The Big Book of Snakes, in fact, was my friend for a long time for blocking. I would literally sit the square on the table and I would pop a big heavy book on top of it, and that would do the job. Now you can still dampen and use this method. I wouldn't recommend using it with a book that you love, but you can put like a thin tea towel or something between the two, or if you've got one with a plastic cover, then that's fine as well. Don't put a big thick towel, because the compression of the fibres on the towel mean that the weight of the book's not really doing anything much, but you can totally improvise. Some people use pin boards. I haven't had much joy with that because of the issue that I talked about at the beginning, to do with the strength of the board and the pins and the comparative movement in them. Pin boards don't tend to be super tough, like blocking boards are a big solid chunk of wood, hopefully. But you know, for just 1 or 2 bits or a smaller project, pin board can work just fine if you've got longer pins. But the big book method, surprisingly useful. You don't even need to have something pinning the edges out, just the weight of a very heavy book on top. That can really help. Likewise, using things like a clothes horse or a washing line can also make a big difference as well. But what do you think? Tell me what your experiences are with blocking. How do you block your projects? Which projects do you block? Do you agree with my suggestions and opinions? Let's have a friendly chat in the comments section below. I love talking to you guys there. And yeah, happy crochet and happy blocking.